Hello, class. Welcome back. We only have a couple classes left, but I'm going to be skipping through some stuff. But I want to hit the main points of the rest of U.S. history. And on the last day, we're going to watch some videos about 9/11, which isn't the greatest topic to end on, but it is. Well, it's the most important day in my lifetime. It really changed the world. Anyway, in the 70s, and you might notice as we go through this, I ripped off some slides here from Mr. Dunn, from the ones he made for the American Culture and History Club. So yeah, no shame. Okay, some general facts about the 70s. Average annual salary, $7,800, which is like nothing compared to today. Cost of a new home, $23,000. Nothing compared to today. New car for just under $4,000. Gallon of gas, 36 cents. Minimum wage, $2.50 an hour. Here is an important one. Voting age drops. It used to be 21, and then it moved to 18 years old. And I want to see if you can figure out why this happened. So, what's going on in the 1970s? This is in the early 70s. That would cause the voting age to drop. The answer is the Vietnam War, specifically the draft. So, if you can't vote until you're 21, and again, when you vote for president, the president is the commander-in-chief of the United States military. You know, it says so in the Constitution. So you have 18, 19, 20-year-olds being drafted into the army, but they can't decide, they can't have any say on who their leader is. So there was a big outcry of this, and a constitutional amendment was passed. Movies, yeah, $1.50. And yeah, we see here the first Earth Day in 1970, so the environmentalist movement is getting going also. Although it really started around Teddy Roosevelt's era, but anyway. Okay, we talked a little bit about this. Wow, in 61, JFK pledged to go to the moon in 10 years. We choose to go to the moon, not because... We choose to go to the moon in this decade and... Oh, this is an awful impression. And do the other things, not because they're easy. This is such a bad JFK impression. JFK's a tough one to impersonate, and that was my worst job ever. Okay, but anyway, 1961, Kennedy basically says, we've always been a people who want to take on challenges, and our next challenge is we're going to the moon, and we're going to beat the Russians in the space race. And this is what happens in July 1969. The Apollo 11 mission lands. We have Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walk on the moon, and the United States wins the space race, and it is a big deal. Okay, this is one we're going to have to skip over. Hey, there's a great movie called Apollo 13. If you haven't seen it, I'm sure you can find it somewhere. It tells this whole story here. But actually, I should bring in... So, because this was a terrible... yeah, I mean, all the people almost died, and there were a couple of other space launches that did not go well. So, as the economy started faltering in the 70s, the government cut NASA's budget a lot. And so, it was sort of like once the U.S. got to the moon... I mean, there were a couple other trips to the moon, but that was sort of the peak of the space program in terms of how much funding it got from the government, and then space missions became less and less frequent as the 70s went along. And one of the reasons was because some of the accidents that were happening. Okay, the civil rights movement, right? So remember, we've been focusing on foreign policy, but the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, now we're in the 70s, and so it inspired other minority groups, and I want to focus here on Cesar Chavez, who led what's called the United Farm Workers Organization, mostly Mexican Americans, who were basically getting paid next to nothing. And it's a similar situation to when we talked about during the Gilded Age with the unions and how immigrants would come over and work for less money. Cesar Chavez, so this is called neo-nativism, he had strong calls for immigration restriction because he wanted to make sure that Mexican Americans like him wouldn't get, wouldn't lose their jobs because someone else is would come over and work for less money. And so, look at this. I mean, like I said, well, there's a famous saying, right? History doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. Well, in this one, remember those pictures when we analyzed the populist movement, right? The farmers and the Populist Party, and they had that. There was that picture with, and I'm going to put it up on the screen. But you have all the different professions on the side of the poster, and then the big farmer in the middle, and I believe it says "We feed you all." This is basically the same thing. It's like, hey, where's your food coming from? Don't treat us like garbage. So the same sort of thing with the populists. This is the same kind of thing that built up with Cesar Chavez and United Farm Workers Organization. Okay, the economy starts going bad in the 70s. Mostly, a lot of it was because the Vietnam War cost a ton of money, and U.S. almost went bankrupt. So what Nixon does is, the first thing, he announces a wage and price freeze, which is a temporary measure. FDR did a similar thing. Essentially, it says that no business can give a worker more money, and stores can't raise prices for product, because what was starting to happen was inflation, where prices were just going up way too fast. Whether this was constitutional or not, I don't know, but he got away with it. And then the U.S. has taken off the gold standard. So up to this point in U.S. history, any currency was backed by gold. Now, and it had to be tied to gold. And remember, again, going back to the populists, they had wanted to introduce silver as a basis for the dollar, silver and gold, right? And then McKinley wins and he signs the Gold Standard Act. FDR, during the Great Depression, he lifts the U.S. off the gold standard just temporarily until the economy can get back together. Nixon takes the U.S. off the gold standard, and we have never been on it. So how do we know what a dollar is worth? Well, it's kind of weird, but a dollar is worth whatever people are willing to pay for it. It is not backed by gold anymore. And this is a term, it's called fiat currency. And it comes from the Latin term fiat, essentially whatever I say it's worth, it's worth. So Nixon, so we haven't been on the gold standard since the 1970s. And money is worth whatever people just agree that it's worth. Okay, the environmentalist movement, gets going in the 60s with this woman on the right. She wrote a book called Silent Spring. And basically, when we think of the 50s especially, and all the different new factories and they're making stuff out, the pollution was getting out of control. With more cars on the road, the pollution was worse. I mean, now we have different standards and stuff, but cars from the 50s and 60s and 70s were polluting like crazy. The other thing was that, how you have, if you ever notice at the gas station, there's, say like unleaded gas, they used to have lead in gas, and the exhaust would drip out onto the roads, and that would eventually leak into the water supply, and it would poison all these fish. So the EPA is formed, so Environmental Protection Agency, under Nixon. So Nixon's remembered for doing a lot of bad things, which we'll get into, but he really helped, fight for the environment. And the EPA sets rules for what, limiting pollution, making cars be up to certain standards. And so with the environmentalist movement that, really got a kickstart in the 1960s with Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, in the 1970s, the laws started coming into place to protect the environment. Keep America Beautiful, Native American commercial. This is just an iconic commercial. It's not the best produced, but it uses an American Indian and the idea of living purely with the land and showing him now with all the pollution in the 70s. And it's short. I'm going to put it up on Edpuzzle though, because it is iconic of the 1970s. Okay, we're going to stop there for now. We'll get into foreign policy next.